Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. I love this museum. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. And I'm going to kind of jump right in on this talk, which I think you'll find as interesting as I do. I am going to concentrate specifically on the subject of power, water power, steam power. This talk has two parts. The first part is historical and kind of traces the development of this, of factories and the way they're powered. And the second part is going to be a quick review of some of the photography that I did, which is displayed on these two wall sections. One's here, one's on the other side. Those are pictures that I took in the 1970s. So getting right into this, the subject matter is going to be power and especially water power. So hydro is the word to remember, okay? That could be our mantra for this. The primary visual that we're going to keep returning to is the river, which is just on the other side of that wall. I'm sure you saw it as you're coming in. The Charles River is here. It's magnificent. The waterfall is just up there. And this entire place is here because of the river and because of the water power. So we'll keep coming back to this. My goal is to use the river and to use this mill complex as a lens through which we can look at other places and understand the way that other factories in other locations developed in a series of overlapping movements. Keep in mind that a mill is really just a box. The earliest ones were wooden, after that very likely brick, occasionally masonry. It's a place where you're going to collect a variety of important inputs, including labor, power, machinery, capital. It takes some vision to do it, and there's always some risk. Of all of these things, then the raw materials come in at one end, finished goods come out the other. That's kind of the idea. But of all these things, the one factor which was not something that you could move around was the power. You could not move it in the early decades of this development, which, by the way, follows the development of our own nation, because they started working on this right after the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, sort of 1785, 1790. That's kind of when all this stuff got going. So the story parallels our own American history. During those early decades, the only way that you could move any kind of a machine, like a sawmill, for example, or a grist mill, was you could maybe have a horse that would go around in a circle. You could maybe have oxen on a treadmill. If it was a really small thing like a spinning machine, you could use a foot treadle. Otherwise, you would have to go to a place where there was a waterfall and put a water wheel into that place. So you had to go where the water was. You could not bring it to you. We're accustomed to flipping lights on, flipping a switch and having something happen. But in these decades, that was not possible at all. There was no steam, there was no railroad, there was no electricity. It was all about hydro. So you had to look at places like this waterfall or lots of others and think to yourself, imagine if you were the millwright, if you were the developer, the guy who wanted to put a factory in there. You have to think, could I put a dam across that? Could me and my friends build that? Can I hire, that guy with the ox team and do that? And if I did do that, would it still be there after the first big storm? Because there's a lot of issues about building something that's strong enough to last like that. In the area right around Boston, there were quite a few possible mill sites. One of the earliest that was developed was right here at Newton Upper Falls, which is upstream from us about 8 miles or something like that, maybe 6 miles. It kind of depends because the river's kind of windy. But this is, if you're not familiar with this site, by all means go. There's the fabulous Echo Bridge is right next to it. And when you're on the top of the bridge, you can look down and see this site. But this was just one typical site in the period around 1780. Of course, it would have been much smaller then. But that was the idea, that you'd have a small mill at a small water power. The Slater Mill in Rhode Island was another pioneering mill. We know it and consider it a famous place, an important historical place, because it was the first one where they had actual spinning machines actually inside a building. So that was 1793. They took off from there, and it became a prototype for other places. But notice how small it is, and it's made of wood. Similarly, Lippett, Rhode Island, which is kind of off in the West Warwick area, Lippett was built in 1809, and the stream that powers this, believe me, in the summer, you can just about walk across it. You look at it and say, is that the thing that ran this place? Because they were really kind of small. So these small mills were proliferating at these certain water powers, places where it was easy to construct the dam, construct a building, kind of like picking the low-hanging fruit. And also, ideally, it would be a place which was not too far from a population center or a transportation center. Typically, that would be a port, like Boston or New London or something like that. For example, the city that we now know as Fall River used to be called Troy, and it did have a fall river. There was a place where the river went over a cliff. It dropped 130 feet and 1.5 miles, and that had 8 mill sites that were developed in the period around 1810. This one, Yantic, is near Norwich, which is, again, near New London. So in this period, these early manufacturers are going out to all of these places. The easy ones, the ones that weren't too hard to get to, not too far, not too difficult, not too big, because you could kind of get it done in a manageable amount of time, maybe a year or so, to build all the structures that were needed and to get some power and to use it. So each of these factory promoters would have to solve this problem and solve it in an individual way that fit that particular site, and you would go to those sites. Another group of them, for example, was in the area now, which is now called Putnam, Connecticut. That was another early center. There was a series of them in the Blackstone Valley as well. So these are places where you were going to build your dam, build your factory, put your machines in and get to work. Let's come back to Waltham. This is a picture of the mill, of the dam here, the one right out there. This picture was taken about 3 weeks ago when the water was moderately high. I'm not sure if you noticed today, it's really high, because we had that big rain last night and there was some rain last week. That water is really pouring over the dam, and actually there's some flooding in the back here just to remind us of how much water power there is. So when engineers measure the power at this place, they say, oh, it's a 500 horsepower dam. That would be constant horsepower, meaning you could get that pretty much all year round, except maybe some drought in the summer, but most of the time 500 horsepower. Right now, on a day like this where you've got extra water coming from a rain, it's way more than that. It could be 3, 4, 5 times that amount, maybe even more, but 500 constant. So keep that in mind, that's how much you can get out of this dam. Now, when the developers of this property first started here, that would be Francis Cabot Lowell, Nathan Appleton, and P.T. Jackson. They were looking for a place to put their establishment. They had just designed a power loom. They said, where are we going to put it? And this particular water power was the best one in the Charles River network. There are at least 5 other places that they could have gone, but they weren't as ideal as this one. There's a 20-foot dam, better power, better access, a longer pond, a lot of good things. So they started off building the first mill, which was the one that's kind of on the right in this, up there. They built that one, and then they built another one right after it. I'm going to show you another way of looking at the same thing. And this image, by the way, gives you a feeling for how rural the situation was. I mean, the environment, there really was not much here. There had been a small paper mill at this site for quite a few years. They bought the paper mill, they bought the water rights that went with it, they bought some property around it, and they started building. This is obviously a map. It's a way of looking down at the site, and I'm going to show you how they developed first the 1814 and then the 1816 buildings. And also, I want to ask you to kind of keep this image in mind, because I'm going to return to this at least 4 more times as we build out with through the decades. The dam is on the left, it's right there. That's the dam. The water comes from left to right. The river goes this way, and some of it is diverted into this head race, and it goes through the mills. Each building had its own water wheel in the basement. So first you had 1 building, then you had 2. First there was 1 water wheel, then there were 2. And if we look at another image of this place, one that's frequently used in this, you can see it out in the lobby, the entrance there. You see mill number 1 on the left. Mill number 2 is on the right. The dam is way over on the left there. And mill number 2 was a little bit bigger than number 1. And they kind of liked the way that it looked. And so they said, let's call that mill, or the power that ran that mill, 1 mill power. So we've got to have some way of talking about this, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to say, there it is. The amount of power that it takes to run that building is 1 mill power. It turns out that's about 70 horsepower, which would be a very small car. Like, I'm thinking maybe like a Volkswagen from the 1960s, a Beetle or something like that, might be that amount. So 70 horsepower, 1 mill power. Now, just to help orient you, this is a similar view to the one we saw, but contemporary, an aerial view, with mill number 1 and number 2 kind of highlighted, just to kind of give you a feeling for it. Because when we come to a place like this now, it's really hard to understand that this wasn't always here. There was nothing here. This building wasn't here. Everything from here almost to the end of this complex was not here, just those 2. So the prototype was small buildings, usually like 4 stories high, kind of narrow because they had to have window light coming in from the sides, a water wheel in the basement, typically a breast wheel, a big cylindrical wheel, and a system of gears that would take the power off the wheel, move it up through the building, and distribute it throughout and then down to the machines. If any of you have ever worked with like a lot of gears, you'll agree with me that it is actually quite difficult. The gears have to be really, really good, and at this time they weren't able to do that. So these things were kind of made of wood and cast iron and different parts that they would kind of cobble together. So it was pretty difficult to make this thing work. But that's what they did. Gear drive in the basement, breast wheels, small buildings. So at these early decades, like right after Waltham was pioneered, the similar developments happened all around New England, but especially in the area of the Blackstone River Valley in Rhode Island, where there were at least 20 sites like that, spread out between Worcester and Pawtucket, Rhode Island. In addition, you had places like, this is also in the Blackstone system, Lonsdale. A lot of these guys really favored these very optimistic company names, by the way, like Hope and Purity and things like that. That was part of the dream. So that was one area, and this is also part of the Blackstone system, Woonsocket, which has a kind of crazy S-curve system, so that you had several individual villages. You've got, let's see if I can get this guy to go for me. Hello there. Maybe my pointer stopped working. So you've got the Globe, the Vernon, the Hamlet. They're like 5 villages together in Woonsocket. Okay. Similarly, in eastern Connecticut, the area between Webster down to Norwich, there's a whole river network of the Quinebaug and Chautauqua River basins. There are at least 18 mills in that section as well. Most of them were pioneered in that early time. And Putnam, I'm going to see if I can point with this way. Putnam is there. Okay, that was one of the big ones. It used to be called Pomfret Factory. Okay, nearby, a little bit west of there, you've got the Rockville area, where the Hockanum River drops 283 feet, 1.5 miles. So you would have a mill at every juncture along the way. So there are, I think, 16 of them. Here, here's one, and then you walk, like 500 yards, and there's another one, and 500 yards, there's another one. So that would be part of that pattern. These places tended to be rural and small. And when we look at depictions of that time, they almost always use the same kind of bucolic notation by putting cows in the foreground, for example, or by more cows. We have a lot of cows in the foreground in these Rhode Island mills. But they're really trying to make the point that it was kind of sleepy, it was kind of quiet, they wouldn't bother the cows. Even in North Adams, which we now think of as being quite a developed place, it started off as a much smaller place. One of the classics in this pattern is the Uxbridge complex that was built up around 2 mills called the Crown and the Eagle. One was, left and right. And each of them, independent mills, each powered by a power canal, gears and water wheel in the basement. And we've got the cow, and we've also got the ox cart. I'm going to see if my little I must say, there's a little laser pointer that's not working, but no, not to worry. I don't need it. Okay, so by 1820, the people who developed this place, Waltham, were getting more ambitious. It was really quite successful. Francis Cabot Lowell died in about 1817, but by 1820, his successors, that would be Nathan Appleton, P.T. Jackson, they brought in a mechanic, Paul Moody. These guys were dreaming of something bigger. So they looked around. It wasn't that hard to find a fabulous spot at the place called Pawtucket Falls, where the Merrimack River comes around a bend, crashes over a lot of rocks, goes around another bend, and heads on downriver. There was already a canal there, a transportation canal to get around the falls. So they said, hey, let's see if we can buy that one. That could be interesting. At the time, they thought maybe there'd be enough power there to run 60 factories, maybe, of that small size, but they weren't really sure. The first one they made, yes?
Sorry, what they were manufacturing at the time here?
Say again?
In that time, what were they manufacturing?
They were making cotton. Cotton, yeah, cotton. And thanks for asking. It was all cotton at that time. Other places did wool, but this one was cotton. And Merrimack was also a cotton mill. And the interesting point that you bring up, the cotton story is a huge story in its own right, which I'm not going to go into. They ran cotton. It came from the South. You figure it out, right? Okay, the Merrimack, this particular mill, used all of the full head that the river allowed, which was about 30 feet at that point. So they kind of cut an extra canal in, fed the water over to this building, put a huge wheel in the basement, and got running with that one. So this became the first mill in Lowell. And the entire rest of the area, the rest of the neighborhood there, was still really undeveloped. It was just farmland at that point. I'm going to step up here and see how that works. Okay, so at the Pawtucket Falls in Lowell, you could get at least 7,000 horsepower out of that dam. So it was at least 12 times bigger than the one out here. It's quite a substantial water power. And as we'll see later, you could even get more than that, but it was at least 7,000. But they didn't know how to measure that at the time. Furthermore, the dam wasn't actually in place for the first several years. They had so much power that they didn't actually need a dam that went all the way across the river. They used a sort of a thing that we'd call a wing dam, where you kind of put something partway into the river, and the water would hit that, and it would kind of come along here, and that was sufficient for the first years of that development. So that in Lowell, the water is pushed through a network of canals. There are a series of mill sites, in this case depicted with these red spots, which are places where you would either get, it was a two-level system, you'd either get 18 feet of head or you'd get 12 feet of head to make the two combined to make the 30 feet. So they were spreading them out this way, and eventually they got up to about 100 mill powers in this area. That doesn't mean 100 individual buildings, because the buildings got bigger and it might take 2 or 3 or 5 of these mill powers to run one building. But that's how they counted it. They got up to about 100. At this same time, they also switched the drive system. Those old gears that was really a problem. So they switched to belt drive, which is more like what you see up here. In fact, it is exactly what you see here. This is all belt drive, and it was a better system. It was easier to manage because you didn't have all those darn gears to deal with. And also you could make belts that ran further, and it was kind of a more flexible system. You got to wonder though, like, how much leather did they use? Because all those belts were leather, and every single one is going around like crazy for years and years. So the whole thing of belt drive was a big deal. All those cows, all that tanning, all that leather. I got to say, when I first came to this town, there was a company over where Polaroid used to be in Cambridge, which had these belts on the outside. They were still in the belt business. They were still in the belt business. It was really crazy, Okay, so at this time also, the railroad finally got to Lowell, which was the first place really that there was a railroad around here, 1835. Oh, hey, thanks. Maybe I will use that. Who knows? Thanks. So the railroad comes to Lowell, and along with it, better transportation and a lot of visitors. People who came to see what was judged to be a miracle of development and also like a new concept of factory operation where things were mostly better and mostly cleaner, and they didn't have all of that sooty, grimy stuff that they saw over in England. So there was a lot of kind of tourism here and journalism. People came and wrote extensively about how fabulous this was. One person who came was Daniel Webster, and he said, "The stupendous works of Almighty God are so well adapted to the wants of men at this place." And he became an investor. He said, "I'll put some money into that." So he was one of the Boston Associate Group, and his name is on the display out there. Okay, so at this point, it's now about 1840, and the belt drive system is operating. This is an interpretation of that same environment that you can see at the boot mill in Lowell, and if you haven't been, you must go. Everything about the national park is fabulous up there. At the same time that Lowell is growing and really taking the spotlight, everyone wanted to go there. Charles Dickens went there. Lots of celebrities would go and look around. But at the same time, smaller mills were proliferating, continuing to develop out in the Rhode Island area, but taking on slightly larger opportunities and with more development. So the one that I just showed you there in Arctic, I'll go back to it. You see now we've got the railroad is now in the foreground, and way up in the background you've got some mill housing. Let's see if like that. Yeah, bingo. Thank you, Bob. Okay, so mill housing is there, railroad is here. This is the same thing seen from above. It's a nice way to dramatize how these mills had to build villages around them because they were out in the country, and because the only way to really get a workforce was to provide a place for them to live. So they would build a set of houses here, and the people would walk down the little paths, and they'd work there, and then maybe they'd take the train. And there's the store. So this became a typical pattern. You saw this a lot around Rhode Island, and some of these places you can still see vestiges of today. Pontiac, for example, is right near the T.F. Green Airport. If you're going southbound on Route 95, when you're just about at Green Airport, you'll see a smokestack, which now has a lot of cell tower stuff on top of it. That's the smokestack of Pontiac. It's sort of behind the Warwick Mall, of all things. But here, they've got everything. We've got not only, this is the earlier mill and a newer one added, we've got the train with a little puff of smoke, we've got the church, we've got the housing down here, the river, the dam, and they would provide everything that people needed. Back to Waltham, how did they do it? So we had two mills, 1814, 1816, but by 1840, the same period we were just looking at, they connected the two, put a building in the center, and moved the wheels into the center. So now the water is going through the center, but it's still only using about half of the water power that was available at that site from the dam that we saw out there. Here's another way to think about it. I've made a couple of these bar graphs just to kind of try to dramatize a point. So one mill power is up there, right? The Waltham Dam was here, so it's actually at least 7 times bigger than that one mill was. But you've got all of these guys who are in the range of about 1,500, like 1,000, 15, 16. Those are pretty big power sites. And they're in rural areas that most of us don't think about too much. Places like Willimantic, Taftville, North Grosvenordale, these are not commonly heard names, but they're important places in this time. And Lowell is way out here at 7,000. Okay, so Willimantic, the river kind of makes a turn, drops down a bit. So there were 4 sites in Willimantic. Each one is about a couple blocks from the other, like they're like 800 yards apart. So the Willimantic set includes at least 1,600 horsepower, but it's in 4 different sites. Oops, I think I went past one. Manville, Rhode Island, which is on the Blackstone River, sits right on top of the river. They were able to get 1,600 out of that. And this shows really nicely the belt drive up here and the turbines in the basement. But this is the time when turbine drive took over from breast wheel. So this is a really nice cross section. It was made by a company that manufactured the turbines. So they said, hey, we'll put this in our catalog and sell more turbines, you know? Okay, shortly after that, about 1850 or so, 48 or 50, Lawrence was developed by the same people who had succeeded at Lowell. They just brought in other investors. We call them now the Boston Associates. It's the same gang. The Cabots, the Appletons, the Jacksons, the Perkins. These family names are very familiar. And these are Boston families that invested in Lowell. They might have invested here as well. And they said, well, let's see what more we can do. We had so much success at Lowell. Let's try going downstream. So they created a completely new site at what we now know as Lawrence. They had to build a dam that wasn't there before. It had to be very high, and there was so much power there that they could make a canal on both sides of the river. So there's one on the north side, one on the south side. Each canal would feed a series of mills. Each mill site would have a series of housing for their workers nearby. The water goes into the canal, through here, and down into the river. When they first started, there was at least 10,000 horsepower there, but later, with some refinements, they got up to at least 15, and much later, even more. I should add, by the way, that these horsepower numbers are tricky because it's hard to measure, it's hard to get good statistics on them. Sometimes I've used hydroelectric as a proxy. It's kind of a moving target, but I think this gives you a sense of the scale of these places. So after they did that one, they said, well, if we can do the Merrimack, maybe we can do the Connecticut River. That should be fun. So they went to Holyoke, where there was a place called Hadley Falls, and said, let's just see if we can put a dam across this one. And they did. The first one was a complete failure. It completely blew out, and they had to come back 2 years later and do it again. But they did succeed in getting a dam across there. And that place generates 30,000 horsepower. So this is now it's a little more than 4 times the power that Lowell had. So with 30,000 horsepower, you have to have a distribution system. You can't just put that all into the basement of one building. That would be preposterous. It ain't going to happen. So what they did was they divided it up, again, in a 2-level system. This is the upper level. These are the mills that use the water first, goes into the lower level, comes around and gets used again, and drops down into the river. So I'm going to go back to this chart for a second. Remember, we looked at the first part up here, but it had a much expanded, size to it. I've changed the scale because we're going to need it. The reason is, after about 1840, the amount of power development went through the roof because of taking on places like Holyoke on the Connecticut River, Turner's Falls, also on the Connecticut River, big water powers, and Saco, Manchester, Lawrence. These are all in the 15, 20, 30,000 range like that. Cohoes, New York, the first iteration of Cohoes, which is where, by the way, the Mohawk River joins the Hudson River. There's quite a big waterfall there, a heck of a lot of water going through that one. So Cohoes was at least 30,000, Holyoke. So you can see this is big. This is really big stuff. And to do this, yeah, Kathy.
Sorry, Steve, can you explain why Turner's Falls was twice?
Because they redid it decades later. The first time around, it's in there twice because the first iteration was a smaller system using, feeding a smaller group of factories. Then the company that owned that came back and they extended the canal 2 miles further downstream and put a hydro plant at the end of it. And so then they were able to get that much out of it down here. So it's a good question and a pretty interesting story with that one too. So what I'm getting at here is that this power growth was enormous, but still all hydro. Going back to Waltham, let's see what happened here. So first in like 1845, it looked like this, but then they came on in 1852 to 55, put another much larger building in, and put a series of turbines right down here. It doesn't show real clearly, but that's where they were. So the water turbines here, and now for the first time in 1855, these guys are using all the water power that was available at this site. They also bought a small steam engine in the 1830s because they had a drought, and they said, oh man, this drought thing is like really bad. We better get a small steam engine. But 150 was not like a big deal. That would be, well, it might be like kind of that big, not a huge thing. So primarily water power, and finally using all the power that they had. Okay. So after about 1870, this growth accelerated more and more. It had been small, it got big, then it got bigger, then it got bigger. Places like Manchester were expanding and using not only all of their water power, but starting to add steam. We'll come back to that in a sec. At the same time, you've got places in Connecticut like North Grosvenor-Dale that would find a pretty good site and put a rather large mill at that spot. This is really quite an impressive edifice, but not as big as some of the others. Further down at Baltic, which is near Norwich, this one at one point was called the largest cotton mill in America. But it didn't last that long as the largest because shortly after that, this one came in, which said, oh, you're no longer the largest, we're the largest one. Panema was 750 feet long, 75 feet wide. It had 250,000 spindles, 265,000 spindles. It's like, really? 4,000 looms, 1,500 horsepower, 1,600 workers. And because of the slightly out-of-the-way location, they had to create a village that went with it as well. And in that village, they had 200 mill houses. In addition, 2 churches, a boarding house, and a company store. This place was quite impressive. All of the village was over on this side. It doesn't show in this picture. So, a visitor to this place exclaimed, looked around and exclaimed, "The magnificent proportions of the Panema Mill at Taffville have a grace and dignity equal in their way to a cathedral." It's like, okay, I would say that's hyperbole, but you know, they were reaching for grandiose reference points because no one had seen things like this before. There just weren't buildings this size, 750 feet long, and then later it was extended, it was even longer after that. So, quickly looking around the map, you can see how we've got Boston, here we go, there he is. Boston is here, you can see the rest of it. The big sites like Lowell, Lawrence, Turners, Holyoke, Manchester, of course up here you've got Dover, Lewiston, Saco up in Maine, but I couldn't quite make the map go up there, so you have to like imagine that they're there. But in addition to those, you've got the entire, look at this here, this is the Blackstone Valley down here, at least 20 sites. This is the area around West Warwick, it's got another 16 or 18 down there. This is the Quinnebog area from here, 16 or 18 sites leading down to Panema, Yantic, that kind of stuff. Willimantic has got at least 4. Rockville over here had at least 8. Well, no, Rockville had 13, I'm sorry. Okay, in that section. Then, in addition, as you go further west into Connecticut, you've got places like Waterbury, Danbury, Derby, over here in New York State, Kingston, Wappingers, Cohoes is over here. Cohoes is there, pardon me. So you can see how there's a kind of a distribution of these further and further out, and sometimes in remote areas. So at this point, we've got a situation where you've got kind of like a 3-tiered system. You've got the really big hydro places, Lowell, Lawrence, and those guys. You've got the medium-sized hydro places, which would be like Willimantic, Panema, where these giant buildings are out in the country. When you see them, you drive over hill and dale, and finally you come over the hill and you look down and say, holy smokes, look at that thing. So they were big, but they were out in the country. And then you've got dozens and dozens of the little guys. So it's kind of a 3-tiered system that way. The steam engine changed everything. Early steam designs started coming in the 1840s. This is a patent and drawing from George Corliss in 1849. But in the period after 1876, these engines got much bigger, better, faster, and Corliss did a wonderful PR coup, accomplishment, by making the engine that ran the entire machinery hall at the Centennial Exposition in 1876. So every machine in that hall was run by this one. It was a big honking steam engine, but it really only had 1,400 horsepower. So at that time, it had to be big to even get to that point. Steam engines were getting better. Everyone was buying them because most of the water power had been kind of captured by that time. There were improvements, things got better. Lowell went from 100 mill powers to 140. They made some new canals. They fixed the alignment of things, kind of smoothed out the edges, got more. But if you really wanted to create a completely new mill, after about 1880, you would use a steam engine to do that. And furthermore, some places, especially Fall River and New Bedford, but first Fall River, were almost entirely steam. Fall River had been a place where there was a falling river and there were water-powered mills, but they got past that really early in the game. Between 1870 and 1875, a whole other group of buildings appeared in Fall River around the pond, which had been kind of a mill pond. All around the edge, they would put up these much larger buildings with steam engines. And at the bottom of the waterfall, they also put another series like this one, where you could actually bring your sailboat or whatever from Narragansett Bay right up to the back of the building and run your steam engine inside. So they had the combination of fresh water for the steam engine, salt water for navigation, steam power, and bigger buildings. Up by the pond, this was more typical. You'd have a huge factory run by steam, using the mill pond really just as frankly, as a cesspool. They used the water, threw all their waste in there. Everyone else did too. It got pretty bad. But that development was all steam. So when you go to New Bedford, Fall River now, you look around and you say, well, what? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why are these buildings in the places that they are? And the reason is because they were clustered around the pond and because it was steam only. There's no water power up there. At New Bedford, they took it one step further and went to a place that had no water power at all. They just said, I think this would be a great place to put a bunch of mills. So they built them, they put their steam engines in, and New Bedford is a completely steam city. So now we had to kind of stick with that for just one second. Now you've got a four-tiered inventory or list of places where you have big hydro, you have the medium-sized hydro, like places like Willimantic, Panama. You've got the little guys, and then on top of that, you've got big steam, especially in Fall River and New Bedford. Okay, back to our little place here in Waltham. What did they do? So remember, it would look like this in 1843, 1845. Then in 1852, they got their turbines. We saw that one already. But in 1887, they brought in steam engines to this place also. They had a 1,000 horsepower steam engine right down here, which is kind of like, there's like a little garden there now. That building has changed a lot, but they had 1,000 horsepower there, 1,000 horsepower engine there, and it supplemented the turbines that were here and the old breast wheel that was there. So now this place has got 500 of water and 1,000 of steam, so it's at 1,500, which is getting big there. Okay. At this point, though, this entire industry was starting to go crazy. There was tremendous competition from other factories, especially in the South, tremendous pressure on wages and labor, tremendous difficulty in managing the enterprises that they created because they got small, big, bigger, bigger, bigger. They just kept at it and kept adding. So places like Waltham said at this point, you know, let's just go bigger. So they had this set up really in 1880s, but 30 years later, 40 years later, they took out that old steam engine, put an even bigger one in. So now there's a 2,500 horsepower engine inside that blue circle, which would be pretty much on the other side of that wall. Some of the masonry that you see in the other room is the foundation for the steam engine, or maybe there were two. There's some question of whether there was one or two, but together they were putting out 2,500, which in turn was then connected using these belts to all of the other system that was already in place. So they just kind of strap it on to that old shaft and say, well, we'll turn it even faster. You wonder, like, how exactly, how much do you really need? Well, the answer is we need a lot because there are more machines and they're running faster. As you crank something faster, it takes more power. So they were just stuffing machines into these buildings and running them faster and faster, trying to compete with mills in the South, mills in other places, just trying to make it work. So from that point, they kind of went into a period of challenge and then a period of decline. Because even with all that stuff, it was still really hard to make it work. And at this point, in 1921, a journalist came to Waltham, and he was really kind of he was working for a trade journal called American Cotton Reporter. And he looked around, and he kind of looked at this part and looked at that part, and he wrote an article, you know, to try to convince people to invest in this place, 1921. And he said, first off, he talked about how there used to be a lot of old stuff here, but we threw all that old stuff away. And now we have new stuff. He said, we do not know of any old cotton mill that has been so thoroughly revamped and re-equipped as Boston Manufacturing. New cards, automatic looms, electric motors. Then he mentioned that there was some water power, but he kind of poo-pooed it. He said, oh, that water power, old stuff, we don't really need that. Then the final quote from him was, the steam plant is the thing. From this guy's point of view in 1921, it was all about the steam, and the water was just like, whatever, we've got some of that. Well, that was 1921. In 1929, Boston Manufacturing almost went out of business. The company essentially closed and then reorganized as a series of smaller businesses, which included the one that was running this room in 1933, which would have been kind of like up there in the second or third floor of the big building that's on the other side of those walls. This image was taken by a photographer who was sent by an electric company to show how brightly lighted the room was and how, get this is like, look, Ma, no belts. So they made a big deal that every loom had its own electric motor. But you wonder, okay, well, where'd that electricity come from? Well, they were making it right here. They took that old steam engine and they said, well, we'll just take that belt and we'll move it over here and we'll use it to run a generator. We'll generate our own electricity and we'll just send it, you know, like 100, 200, 300 yards down to the motors that are there. Much later, they would join a grid and that whole thing built out. But initially, they were generating their own electricity right on the spot. Okay, so by this time, though, this industry was really in a serious decline. It had peaked at about 400,000 workers, and it just kept going down and down and down, decade by decade. Sometimes I think of it as being a little bit like, as if the Titanic took 40 years to sink. It's like, we know it's going down, we know it's going to happen, but it's just taken a really long time. And it was largely due to the competition that was from the South. So that by the time I showed up in the mid-70s, this building had this appearance. No more looms, very few workers, lots of empty spaces. Okay, so that created a situation where you had a lot of leftover mill buildings. The buildings were still here. That's one of the amazing things about this story is that we go to these great water power sites, we build these enormous buildings, we run them for a century or so, and then walk away and just leave them sitting there. And there were quite a few of them. Now, I'd say in the last 30 or 40 years, many of these have collapsed, burned, or in one way or another, they've disappeared. But some of them have not. This is the Panema Mill in Taftville. And that's what it looked like in '05. This was a view of the interior. Remember, 750 feet long. This is a really enormous space. And the idea was that they would put apartments in there, which that project has mostly moved along and mostly has been completed. But when I first went there, it was not underway at all. They just were kind of cleaning it up. Places like Holyoke, where you have magnificent buildings on this fabulous canal, but most of the buildings have actually disappeared So you have this kind of pockmarked landscape where you've got like an empty lot and then a factory, and then an empty lot and a factory. It reminds me a little bit of a aged prize fighter who's had all his teeth knocked out. You know, it's like, oh yeah, you know, tooth, missing, tooth, missing, like that. North Grosvenor is now a designated historic place, and it's being rehabbed. It will be used for apartments and also small office space. Fall River had quite a few of these big granite mills, but over the years they have either burned or been demolished or just been chewed up like this. So Fall River is another one of these pockmarked places where it's like empty lot, oh, factory, empty lot, factory. Typical of that kind of development. You see the same thing in Lawrence, you see the same thing in Lewiston. Most of these places have that same problem. Quite a few of these places have burned down. And when they burn, they go up like a torch because the floors are made of wood. The wood is saturated with oil, either machine oil or lanolin from working with wool. And once they start to burn, boy, it's a bonfire. All you can do is stand back and watch. Sometimes you just don't know what to do with the darn thing. This mill was sitting adjacent to Route 95 as you go from Attleboro into Pawtucket. If you were southbound on 95, it was exactly on the right. You could almost touch it as you went by. It looked like this about 8 years ago. Get this one. It looks like that now. It's like, okay, we couldn't lease it, we couldn't sell it. Let's just completely erase it. It's just a big pile of bricks. And then that was a surprise, but not unexpected.
Massachusetts Digital Equipment, weren't they one of the first companies to go in and rehab a mill building?
Yes, absolutely. And the story of Digital and Maynard is a really great story. There might be one picture in here coming up, but I might have pulled it out. I kind of forget on that one. So reusing these places becomes a real challenge. It's, for some people, it's an inspiring challenge because you get to preserve an important part of our industrial history, but it's also really difficult. It's really expensive. This is one in River Point, Rhode Island. It's again down near the Warwick Mall kind of area, Royal Mills. And this one is used for housing. It's just divided up into apartments. Willimantic has several mills that have been repurposed as apartments. Good use. This is the Digital mill in Maynard, which is now being redesigned as a kind of like an office park for rather large software companies, things like that. So that's what Maynard looks like now. And you're absolutely right that Digital rescued Maynard for a good, 20 years, something like that. There are a couple people here who worked for Digital in Maynard. And that was an amazing thing, but eventually they also had to walk away from it. So that was Maynard. And now that brings us back here to our own Boston Manufacturing Francis Cobbett Lowell mill. This is an aerial view. Again, mill number, get this pointer, mill number 1 would have been there, mill number 2 would have been there. The whole thing is about 14 miles from Boston, something like that. It's a reminder of how the water power drove this place and created it, and it explains why it was here. Water power was everything. How's that?
It's really interesting in the picture. You have a solar power on the roofs.
Yeah, there's a little bit of solar over here. You're absolutely right. Solar is there because this was taken just 6 months ago or something like that. Okay, so water power was everything for a long time. In fact, if you look back to about 1880, there was a point where almost half of all of the power in New England was still water power. Even though they're using all that steam, the amount of water was enormous, and it just kept going and going. But by the time I showed up in the 70s, it was really greatly in decline. So what I did then was to see what I could do as a photographer. And the next section of pictures we're going to look at quickly sprints through the pictures that are on the walls over here. Because the whole thing is run long, I'm going to be really quick with this. But I just wanted to say that when I stumbled onto this subject in the 1970s, I was astonished and fascinated. I said, wait a minute, this is the greatest story ever, you know, that it's something that I had bumped into. It just as a way of exploring America and understanding New England. So I went to quite a few different mills between 1973 and 77. Those pictures are on these walls over here. I encourage you to take a look. In this case, I've reorganized the pictures by the places where they were taken. This first group was in Fall River at Providence Pile Fabric, and the man on the left is Joe Paniatowski. The man on the right is John Valeriana. I have most of the names of most people, but not all. And I have quotes from some of them that I used in the book that I made at that time. Joe said, "My wife says I'm a sloppy man. But when it comes to weaving, I just like to look at yards and yards of perfect cloth. It's very difficult to do, and that's what I strive for. That's how I get my satisfaction." Man, we would hire this guy for sure, right? Because he's the guy who's going to keep your mill running. John over here said, "It's the best job I ever had. 30 years, it's a long time to weave, but I don't regret it." These are, for the most part, most of the people I met really liked their jobs and were proud to do it. And for the most part, these were people who had started when they were kids. They started when they were 10, you know, working with their parents, that kind of thing, and had been with it, you know, for their entire career. So moving along, still at Providence Pile, Leo Miranda on the left, Jose Raposo on the right, typical of the people who came from the Azores in the 1970s to work in Fall River and New Bedford, which they would call Fall Rive New Beige. So he was, you know, in that group. Then I went to the Stamina Mill in Forestdale, which is kind of in the Woonsocket area, a really small, really old place. It was kind of limping along, but they let me look around. This is the card room there. This guy was a millwright. His picture's over there. His name is George DeSarin. And his statement to me was, "I could retire, but I wouldn't think of it. I weld, I cut, I rig, you name it, I do it." I mean, this is the guy you want to be the millwright for sure, you know. Put him in the machine shop, and unfortunately, he never did zip his fly up, but, you know, at the time, I didn't notice. Here he is, decades later. Okay, then I went to Andrews Worsted in Pasco, Rhode Island. Pasco is even more rural than Woonsocket. Worsted, by the way, is a woolen product, and these guys made plaid. So on the left, you've got Beatrice Rochefort. She would say Rochefort, classic French name. And Bea said to me, I have a really nice long interview, but here's one excerpt. "I've been a mender just about all my life. It takes a long time to learn. It's not just sewing, it's almost like weaving by hand. You look for wrong draws, skippy thread, cross picks, floats, thread out. Those are things you gotta fix. It takes a lot of experience before you see those things. But you know, I've worked enough. From age 16 to 62, that's enough." So that was B. The guy on the right, his name is Russ Herzog. He was a timing chain builder. These things in the foreground are I said timing chain, they're actually pattern chains. These are the chains that are used to determine the way the plaid pattern is created. They control the up and down movement of the heddles. So he builds these chains and then takes his break there. Quincy Dye in Woonsocket, tough place to work. And of course, when they're done with you know, all the dyes and stuff, in the river, that's where it goes. Can't do that now. I was really lucky to get up to Harmony, Maine, and meet this guy at Bartlett Yarns. His name is Francis Grant. He's a mule spinner, and he was doing a job running a machine that is so archaic that it was the only one I ever saw. This is something that really went out 50 years before, this mule spinning machine, where it's a crazy machine, a really long thing that would go backwards. You would throw some levers and walk backwards as it spun the thread out, typically woolen, and then you'd throw another couple levers and go forwards as it wound the thread back up onto its spindles. Really complicated. And by the way, look at the ceiling in this thing. All belt drive. In 1975, you know, this kind of stuff running these. And notice also, not much safety equipment in here. Like, don't get stuck in that belt, because that was a typical accident was you'd get, your clothing or something would get caught in the belt drive, and first thing you know, they'd pull you in. Okay. Then I went to Arbica Webbing in Pawtucket. Arbica specialized in narrow fabric, which means that the width of the product was typically like 3 or 4 inches. This would be something like an Ace bandage would be a classic narrow fabric product, or maybe a seat belt in a car or something, woven narrow, a completely different kind of machine. The woman on the left is Genevieve Riley. I don't know the woman on the right's name, but she's working in a thing that's called the creel. The creel is an area where you prepare the threads and direct them onto the beam where they'll be wound up and then taken over and moved over to the loom. More Arbica, these guys are loom fixers. These are the jacks that control the pattern up here, and something went wrong with the jack up there. Still at Arbica, I spent a lot of time there. It was really a great place. On the left, they're doing a thing called drawing in. The guy on the right, his name is Paul Rankiewski. He is a cleaner, and that's what he's doing. You climb in there and clean it out, get all the lint out, do all of that. Then I went to Conrad Jarvis in Pawtucket. It was a braid mill. I'd never seen one of these things before. Totally crazy machines where you have a big circular thing with spindles running around the circumference, and the braid is formed in the center, and then it goes down into a bin at the bottom. Very complicated, extremely loud, and one of the largest interior spaces I ever saw that was completely filled with machinery like this. The guy on the left is Jose Corralo. The woman on the right is almost impossible to find, but there she is, taking care of those braid machines. That entire room really only had like 5 people working in it because most of the time it was automatic. Then I went to Wanalancet in Lowell. Wanalancet was occupying the former Tremont and Suffolk mills in Lowell, run by a manufacturer named Ted Larder, who welcomed me in and helped me out a lot. It was really a great relationship. There I met Albert Byro, who's on the left. He's kind of our poster guy, right? He's a weaver and loom fixer. And Lionel Turcott on the right. And Lionel was also a loom fixer, but he said to me, he went on and on about it, how he did his job. But one thing that really stuck with me, he said, a textile mill always fascinated me. You have a certain amount of machinery to keep running. If you can get it running, you're happy. You set up your machines and you watch them work for you. So his attitude was, hey, I can stand over by the window and watch the machines work. He said, that's the way I like it. You set them up and watch them work. Great guy. Okay, then, still at Wanalancet, one of the weave rooms on the left, Slasher on the right. This guy's name is Mr. Ferrara, Francisco Ferrara. There are actually 2 people, the man on the top there. Then I went to the Lawrence Print Works in Lawrence, and I went into their boiler room, met the chief engineer. His name is Richard Wilder. He still hasn't finished his lunch. A really long lunch for Richard. He said it was kind of boring, this job, because most of the time you just sit around and the boilers just do their thing and then nothing happens. Oil. At this point, oil. In the past, it would have been coal, you're right, but now, definitely oil. They're just burning diesel fuel. Then I went up to the Bates Mill in Lewiston, where I met the woman on the left. Her name is, she would say, and like in French, her name would be Alice Veilleux. In English, she'd say Alice Velix. There she is. She's a spinner, and she's cleaning this spinning frame up, which is partly why there's a lot of stuff on the floor. Ordinarily, it wouldn't really be this dirty. So this kind of makes it look a little more funky than it would be. But also, there's another thing that it took me a while to figure this out. But when people go to work in a kind of a dirty place, they change their clothes. You go to the locker room, you take off your good clothes, and you put on some crummy clothes because you know you're going to get dirty. And that's what we see here. I saw the same thing in Arbica, Wanalancet. They all do this thing where the women are frankly wearing rags. They're wearing like torn up old clothes, because like why bother putting your good clothes on? When the day's over, you go back to the washroom, clean up, put better clothes on, and then leave and be glad to go. On the right, this is the same room where that picture was taken. I went back, it was about 8 years ago, something like that, and that picture was taken in an area along near that bank of windows, right back there. So you can see how much it's changed, and of course now it's empty, because almost all of these places have closed. All of these businesses are gone. This is a story which is, I caught it at a time when there was still something to see, even though every time I would talk to someone, I'd say, well, I'm here to do a book about the textile industry in New England. And they all said the same thing. They said, you're 50 years late. You know, you should have seen it when I was like a teenager. You're 50 years late. So there were still some vestiges. I was lucky to find them. And the last group that I met was right here in this complex, the Puritan Dress Company, which was in another building, like the building next to this building. They were still cutting fabric, sewing dresses, and running that business there. But that also disappeared shortly after this picture was taken. In 1980, I was very fortunate to hook up with Mike Folsom. His wife, Marcia, is right here. Mike was an industrial archaeologist and historian, and he wanted to work with the developers of this mill to get the federal tax credits that would enable them to preserve the historic structure and convert it into housing, subsidized housing, which is what it is today. And also, as a component, to have an educational facility, which is the one we're in right now. Mike and I went all through this place. He was the historian, I was the documentary photographer. The pictures went to the Library of Congress, and they are there to this very day. So that if you look for them online, they'll pop right up. At a certain point, he and I were in one of these big weave rooms, and I said, Mike, why don't you just go sit down on that bench? I'm going to take your picture. And I'm glad I did, because this is one of the few images that really captures that time, that place, and the amazing Michael Folsom, who made all of this possible. So at that point, I'm going to just slip over to a last picture of the river and the mill and say, that's a wrap for this part, and now I'm going to answer questions. So, just one second. Let me quickly say, I love answering questions. I know this whole thing ran long, but I would love to answer your questions, and we'll start with you.
You talked a lot about the technical aspects of the running of the mills. Can you talk a little bit about the technical aspects of your photography?
Yes, I can. I'll be somewhat brief on that one, because I think it's a little... Okay, I'll repeat the question.
I have a microphone for the questioners.
Yeah, okay, I'll repeat that one because it's the first one, okay? His question was, I talked a lot about manufacturing technology. What about camera technology? And the short answer to that in this case is that all of the photographs in this body of work, the ones that are displayed, were made with a Hasselblad 500C and 2 lenses on Kodak Tri-X film. It's something I got into. I really wanted to do something better than 35, and someone said, well, maybe you should try the Hasselblad out. Oh, okay, yeah. Go to Phil Levine. Okay, yeah, okay. So and it was a whole thing of learning that. I used the Hasselblad for all of the worker pictures and a lot of the other stuff. But then several years into it, I started using a view camera as well. So I worked with a 4x5 view camera, again shooting primarily on Tri-X, and using really 2 lenses. I had a 90 and a 150. So the workers were Hasselblad 500C. The buildings and some of those images were made with a view camera. Next question? Yes, ma'am, here. Why don't you tell me your question and I'll repeat it back.
It's not a question, it's a statement.
Yes.
Kathy and I are here from the American Textile History Museum in Lowell, which closed last year, bankrupt. Yes. And I'd like to tell you that years ago, you gave us some of the original prints that you used for the book.
That's right.
And you did give us permission to use them whatever way we wanted, and we did.
Yes.
And the entire library, including your pictures, are now at Cornell University.
I'm glad to hear that.
Because we could not get anybody in New England to take not only the library, but the artifacts, the clothing collection, the textiles,
Yes.
and the machinery. The machinery is now in North Carolina in a small town.
I would like to know more about where it landed in North Carolina, but I appreciate you bringing that up because the story of the American Textile History Museum in Lowell is a really important one. And I had a very important connection with the guy who designed that museum, Paul Rivard, because he had been at the Slater Mill before. And so Paul and I had many, many connections. And the fruit of some of his labor was that museum in Lowell. And it was really a damn shame that they closed that, but they did. But speaking of Lowell, let me quickly say that the national park and its interpretive work is, in my estimation, a fabulous teaching opportunity and well worth your time and worth our support. So, yeah.
Looks to me as if water power is free and coal and oil cost money. Why in the 1860s and 70s did some of these places switch from water to coal? Or am I misunderstanding?
That's a really good question, and it comes back to part of it is historical and part of it is about energy pricing and things like that. First, to clarify, the water power continued to be used at least up until like the 1930s. There came a time when people started to say, you know, this water thing is too much trouble. Let's just buy electricity from somebody else, or you know, they would have some other solution like that. But well into the 20th century, at least up until like 1920 or so, most of these water power places were still using their water wheels. It's just that if you wanted to go bigger, the water had been pretty much used up. So to go bigger, you had to add steam. So the pattern, which we see right here in this mill, was we're using our water, we're going to use more, then we're going to use more water, and eventually we used it all up. So now we're going to add steam, and we're going to keep on growing. And if anything, there's the takeaway in this talk, I think, is really about that progression of small, big, bigger, increasing ambition, increasing scale, increasing power demands, and then big, big, bigger, busted. It's like, what happened, you know? We did all of this and then walked away. Okay, but then, okay. Indeed, many, many factories went south and a bunch of them closed as well. And back to your point, though, about, yes, water power, it feels like it's free, but you do have to build a lot of stuff. You have to, you know, dams and canals and wheels and governors and all manner of things that have to be built. But once you build them, then the rest of the water is sort of free. And it's mostly a renewable resource. I mean, it is a renewable resource. It's just there's a lot of work to getting it done. I sometimes say that the same thing happens in digital photography, that it costs you thousands of dollars to get started, and then after you've done that, the next picture is free. So that's what happened with the water. But when they shifted over to steam, yes, they had to burn coal. And you have to have a railroad to bring the coal because it wasn't here. So we've got a whole system of coal mining and railroads, which ran on steam, of course, bringing the coal here, putting the coal into the boilers, of which you had to have so many boilers to create the steam that would run so many machines. It was a really, really big deal. And then eventually they said, maybe we don't have to burn coal, we'll switch to oil. So this mill switched to oil like maybe in the 1920s, I'm not sure exactly, but around there. So eventually they get done with the coal, now we're burning oil. But still, you're paying for that. And by the way, that waterfall out there, 500 horsepower, has been unused since 1930, maybe 1940. Nobody has any record of that water being used after 1940. That's 78 years of free power being wasted. It's like, really? Is it too much trouble? Anyway, next question.
Steve, I've got the microphone.
oh,
Steve, back here.
Yeah, go ahead.
There are a couple of questions that I have.
Oh, I know
One-
you.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael.
There are a couple of questions or topics which I'd love you to sort of discuss a little bit because I think they're fascinating. One is the innovations that the textile industry brought to the labor force and how the labor force changed over time from the very beginning of those days to the later days. So I think you know something about that. Secondly, It's very interesting to me that the textile industry was one in which precise measurement played a key role, in the sense that it was a system, a measured system, where the output of one set of machines had to be precisely measured so that it would fit to the input of the next series of machines.
good
That's
point.
kind of an
Yeah.
interesting idea. And the role of mathematics in actually making the textile industry possible. That's something that I found surprising and truly interesting. And then the third topic that maybe you could talk about is that it's always been
Michael,
my
I think you only get 2 topics. On
well,
this.
let me ask one more. Let me ask one more, because it's my understanding that the textile industry introduced a new form of capitalism
Yes.
into the United States, and I think that's something that's worth your talking about.
Well, thank you. Michael's a friend of mine, and he's prompting me with the subjects that he and I both find very interesting. I must say, I'll answer your questions, but I'm going to be extremely brief, because each subject is quite extensive, okay? So one was about workers and the people who lived in these places. And I'll just say that it's an absolutely fascinating story of an evolving workforce. Initially, people who lived in New England, farm girls who came into work in Lowell and places like that. But later, immigrants who came initially from places like Quebec, from Ireland, the Great Famine, then later from other parts of Europe, later from the Azores, a tremendous flow of immigrants coming in. And in many cases, they came to these factories because there was work there, because there was a need for unskilled or semi-skilled labor, jobs you could learn pretty quickly. So the flow of immigrants into these places was enormous. And frequently it was divided by place of origin. So you have a place like, for example, Lewiston, Maine, or Woonsocket, Rhode Island, where almost everyone was French Canadian. You'd have another place, maybe like, well, at some other mill, where everyone would be from Italy. Another where everyone came from Poland. And you can see this sometimes with you see these social clubs, like you go to some place like, in Holyoke or something, they'll say, oh, Polish Social Club, or Italian Friends Society. These are leftovers from those immigrant groups who came in. So it's a fabulous story, well worthy of a much longer presentation some other time. Next one, about the technology thing. Yeah, real important. That when they started off, they were kind of making things out of wood, and it was kind of hard to make it work. But as the story progresses, the refinement in machine making and the refinement in measuring, every single thing about making these machines work was refined and improved again with new developments and new patents. And you're right, you have to kind of measure things, and you've got to measure how much water is coming. That was a really big deal. Just to measure the water it was decades of trying to figure that out. People like Francis and Lowell, for example, that was their main thing, was trying to measure the water to see, well, maybe these guys are taking too much and they're not paying for it, that kind of thing. So the measuring, the timing, the refinement, the ability to even make something like these machines here, like that stuff, that's hard to make. It's really, really difficult. And it took decades for that to become possible. And then as they got better, they said, well, now we can do this, we could do that, like making a steam engine. Let's make a better steam engine. Let's have better valves. Let's make it bigger. Let's make it more efficient. And each time they would kind of bring it up like that. And the last one about mathematics, I'm going to leave for somebody else. Your question. Peter.
If you wait for the microphone, everybody can hear you.
Beautiful images and an even more compelling story. So thank you. Just fabulous.
Okay.
So right now, Boston is in the middle of this incredible boom in architecture, driven a lot by innovations in technology. It reminds me a lot of the way the city might have been in 1870 or 80, post-war, post-Civil War boom.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's all great. But I'm really glad that you included that electric light picture at the end in the 1950s. sitting on their hands, right? Doing nothing while their labor moves
Yeah.
south and the mills move south. And causing a period of depression in Boston from 1910 to 1960,
I agree.
50 years.
I agree.
Do you want to, I hate
Should I give a dissertation on that one? Well, first off, I agree. And the central point here really, which amplifies Michael's question back there about, well, what about capital? What about the business organization, that whole thing? So this part of the subject is really looking at, well, why did these companies go out of business? What went wrong, really? Part of it was competition, a lot of competition. A lot of it was labor cost driven because Southern labor was cheaper and either not unionized at all. It was just cheaper. So they could, a company like West Point Pepperell, for example, which had numerous big cotton mills up here, would say, well, I'll just make my next mill in South Carolina. So they just walked away from this one, built a new one down there, put new machines in that one. It might have had some water, but mostly those were steam-driven places, and then later electric. So they were able to move it down there, and then you say, well, where's Pepperell now? Where's that company? Well, it's in Spartanburg, Georgia, or something like that. And even there, they're struggling. Now, back to this thing about sitting on your hands. I agree 100%. When I came to Boston, around the same time you did, maybe, this area was really stuck. It was kind of the end of a long period of decline. And in that article about Henry Cobb in the paper a couple days ago, he said the same thing. He said it was moribund. That's the word he used. Henry Cobb, a famous architect, Hancock Tower, stuff like that. Moribund. And what had happened was that most of these companies had decided that they just really weren't interested anymore. First off, by the time you get there, this is like the third or fourth generation of a particular family. There was some really enterprising guy who did it the first time, and then he'd have a couple sons, and then they'd have a couple of sons and daughters, and some of them would be manufacturers, but others would become poets or something like that, or they'd go into, their names are everywhere. The Cabot, Forbes, Lowell, Appleton, these names are everywhere around our place, and you go to every hospital and they've got names everywhere like that. So after some generations, frequently the people who were running it, they lost interest. Secondly, they wanted a better return on their investment, and they could get that somewhere else. For example, you could invest in the Western railways. You could invest in California. You could even invest in something in Europe. So they took their money and put it elsewhere, and they simply did not bother to modernize. So these establishments just got older and older, by not changing. A lot of these places I went to in the 70s, they hadn't changed in 100 years. Yeah, it's the same machine. You look at that, when was that thing made? Oh, 1890. Okay. Like that mule spinner that I showed you up in Maine, I'm sure that machine was 100 years old. It had to be, because that's when they made them, and then they just stopped. So there was a lot of sitting on their hands. Another question? You, sir. Yeah.
More of a comment than a question. You mentioned the boot mill in Lowell.
Yes.
The Lowell National Historic Park, there's a working, if you want to know what it's like, there's a working weave room at the boot mill.
Correct.
Go in there and you can hear it and feel how it really works.
Correct.
There.
Yeah.
Canal tours are wonderful. I can't recommend going up to Lowell, not maybe earlier in the season than now, but there's a lot going on at that national park.
I totally agree. I agree 100%. And by the way, that weave room in the boot mill, of which there was a picture in this presentation, it does give you that feeling. There's one thing to remember. Most of the looms in that room are not actually working. There, about a third of them are working. Imagine if it's that noisy with 1/3 of them going. Imagine what it's like when they're all going. Furthermore, it's a little bit hard to appreciate, but when you go into a room full of looms, a loom basically does a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of slamming around because you're throwing that shuttle back and forth. There's a tremendous amount of vibration. So the whole place is kind of like rumbling. There's a lot of that, and it's incredibly noisy. And on top of that, the air is kind of full of dust, so it's a really tough working environment. I think I'm going to do maybe 2 more questions. What do you think? 2 more? Madam?
I just had a comment.
Yeah.
About the fact that a lot of, from what I've read, that a lot of after the Civil War, constructed right next to the cotton fields, and then they would have the labor, everything was right there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm not exactly sure how to measure that, but it does speak to the very important subject of the relationship between cotton and slavery and cotton mills. And we have a lot of abolitionists in the Boston area in the 1840s and 50s, and they started to talk about what they called the unholy alliance between the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. That was kind of the way they characterized it, because they said, wait a minute, this cotton is coming from Mississippi, and it's all slave labor. No slaves, no cotton. No cotton, no cotton mill, right? Pretty simple. One more question. Yes?
I think one of the reasons, too, that mill owners here abandoned mills here and went south was that the building itself were antiquated.
Yes.
Multi-story buildings.
Yes.
You could go south, buy cheap land, and put in a one-story building.
Yes.
Most of these new mills that were built, after maybe 1930 are one-story, 1940.
Exactly.
That was much easier to operate.
Right.
Rather than having rooms on a upper story.
That's a very good point. Just to amplify, she's pointing out that if you built a new mill in the South, it could be a one-story operation. Multi-story is a problem because you're always moving stuff around, changing levels, using elevators or like freight elevators and stuff like that. Multi-story is just trouble. The original hydro mills had to be multi-story because of the power system and the need to have more light coming in and an arrangement of all that belt drive and stuff like that. But it's a really important subject. So I think I'm going to wrap this up at this point. Is that okay with you guys? We'll wrap it up, okay? Thanks. Thank you.